Welcome to the Case for Life program, friends. Great to have you with us. Well, it's been kind of an interesting week on the internet. Seen a lot of pro-abortion propaganda put forward. And lo and behold, we're going to talk about one that's come up more than once on this show. I'll get to that in just a second. But I do want to remind you of a couple of things. Number one, please visit the site of our primary sponsor, Life Training Institute. That's the organization I am president of. And there you will find information on our speakers, where we'll be out presenting. You'll find resources you can use to help defend your pro-life views. So be sure to go visit our site at Life Training Institute. Second thing I want to remind you of, if you have not yet taken our basic course, Pro-Life 101, I encourage you to do it because in today's world, we're seeing more and more of personal hostile attacks aimed not at refuting the pro-life argument, but aimed at destroying those who hold pro-life views. And I'm going to talk in this program today about why that is happening. But you need to be equipped to keep the main thing, to keep the discussion focused on the actual argument that is in play, not what people want to make it, which is a personal attack on you. So please go look at that course. It's called Pro-Life 101. You can see the information about it on our sites. Okay, this week I was kind of just surveying a page I occasionally look at called The Progressive Parent. Now you might be thinking, why would I be scrolling Facebook and reading posts from somebody called The Progressive Parent? Well, because whoever this is who runs this site tends to post some of the most fallacious arguments in favor of abortion advocacy, but these are arguments the public buys into. They resonate with the public. So it's good to just from time to time review what's out there. And again, we've talked about this in other situations, but here it is again. Here's the post. Okay. You can't call yourself pro-life if you don't vote to support the lives of people who already exist. The pro-controlling uterus haters are pro-birth. They are not pro-life. Voting for someone to exist and then not providing for them support in order to do so at every age that follows being born is diabolically hypocritical. Now, elsewhere on this same post, we just get a litany of accusations. For example, you don't care about babies, who, by the way, become grown-ups. If you haven't noticed, you care about controlling pregnant people or those who would become them. Words have meaning. Support life that already exists or shut the blankety blank up with your self-righteous delusions and fake aggrandizing of the title pro-life. And then they go on to say, look, just go eat something and die. In other words, I'll leave it to your imagination what they want us to eat. Now, a couple of things here. Let's set aside for the moment the anger. And by the way, there comes a point in your ability to defend your pro-life view where you have to kind of shove the angry tone off the page and just look at what are they arguing? What are they actually saying? Now, notice right away, there is a fallacious attempt to assume the unborn aren't human, because the post says you should care more about people who already exist than those who don't. So right away, you see there's a hidden and undefended premise here. They are assuming the unborn don't already exist. In other words, they're assuming they're not human beings like the rest of us. Nothing in this post argues that they're not human. They just assume it. And we've talked about this again and again on this show, but it comes up again and again, so it bears repeating. Think about all the street-level arguments on abortion. Oh, you don't trust women to make their own private decisions. Oh, you don't think women are capable of being free moral agents. Oh, you want to force poor women to have more kids they can't afford to feed. I mean, just go down the list of all the arguments you hear at the street level, and virtually all of them assume the unborn aren't human. And it's vitally important we deal with that before we do anything else. Set aside the anger, set aside the feeling like you just want to counterpunch and come after this knucklehead. And yeah, they are knuckleheads. People who write this are not clear thinkers. They're not deep thinkers. They're agitators. If this person had to show up at a formal debate and engage a well-trained pro-lifer, this person at the Progressive Parent would be destroyed. Why? Because they actually aren't presenting a case. They're just launching ad hominem attacks on the person. They're assuming the unborn aren't human. But notice right away, there's the assumption that the unborn don't already exist. That's the first thing I would deal with. Then the second thing I would deal with the premise that how does it follow that because you oppose the intentional killing of an innocent human being, you have to fix everything wrong with society? That's basically what's being said here, that you have to take responsibility for their food, their clothing, their education, their self-care, whatever, ad infinitum until when? I don't know when, but apparently helping them get here is not enough. Now let's test this for a moment. Imagine an emergency room doctor, an ER physician, heroically saves the life of a drug addict. We'll just say a dude strewn out on heroin, okay? He is an addict, his life is a mess, and he's near death, but somehow this ER doctor pulls him back from the brink and saves this guy's life. Would anybody in their right mind go to that ER doctor and say, well, I see you saved this guy's life, but what are you doing about his healthcare needs moving forward? Are you going to pay for his time in a rehab center? Are you going to work to make sure he goes on a nutritious diet so he isn't tempted to relapse back into alcohol and drug addictions? Are you going to make sure he has a place to live? And are you going to make sure that he can live somewhere that won't trigger his addictions? Well, anybody that went to this doctor and said, okay, you saved his life, now you're responsible for everything else that's related to his well-being moving forward, would be laughed off the planet. But that is precisely the logic that's in play here with this post. When somebody says, oh, well, hey, you're all for people before they're born, but what are you doing to help them afterward? This is utterly fallacious. It doesn't follow at all that because you oppose the intentional killing of an innocent human being, you are thereby responsible to fix everything and every challenge they might face moving forward in terms of their health or well-being. It is enough that you saved lives. And we understand this. I mean, if you even think about it, nobody in their right mind attacks the American Cancer Society because they treat one disease and not all of them. I mean, the American Cancer Society is not publishing papers on curbing heart attacks. They're not dealing with pulmonary embolisms. They're not dealing with, things like diabetes, Crohn's disease, Lyme disease. I mean, the list goes on. But nobody goes to them and says, we think you're hypocritical because you're only focusing on one disease and not treating all of them. If you were a real healthcare organization, you would treat them all. But there's another thing here that I want to keep you focused on. Let's suppose pro-lifers are indeed the worst people on the planet. We don't give a rip about people once they're born, and we're just generally nasty people. Now, I don't believe that. That's a lie, but let's accept it. We're that bad. How does it follow that our pro-life argument is thereby refuted? In other words, can bad people still make good arguments? Yes, because arguments stand on their merits, not the person making them. Premise 1, it's wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human being. Premise 2, abortion intentionally kills an innocent human being. Conclusion, therefore, abortion's wrong. That argument stands or falls apart from the person making it. In other words, the argument could still be a good one, even if it were a computer that generated that argument. Now, I don't think computers are ever going to get to the point where they can reason inductively the same way that human beings do without being programmed from an outside source, in other words, a human being. But what I'm getting at is it doesn't matter the source of the argument. Now, later in this same post, in the added text surrounding the meme that I just read for you, there's this notion that pro-lifers are just driven by their hateful religious ideology grounded in segregationism. Okay, this is a very common thing we hear all the time. And again, go ahead and grant the premise that we are that bad, that the motivation for our whole pro-life advocacy is that we're really just closet segregationist, racist, if you will. Suppose that were true. How does that refute our argument? And I think you can see it does not. And what we end up with in this case, in the case of this post, is really nothing more than the genetic fallacy. And that's where you fault an idea based on its origins. So you might, for example, if you were engaging in the genetic fallacy, say, well, we're not going to believe in welfare because the only people who are advocating for welfare for the poor are those who want to take money from the rich. Okay, that may be true. It may be true that the people advocating for public assistance for poor people want to take money unjustly from those who have it. All right, even if that's true, does that mean that the argument against or the argument for public assistance is thereby defeated? No, you would want to argue more prudently and certainly more intellectually honest than that. The source of an idea does not refute an idea. Not at all. And I think we can see this. There's bad people who've supported all kinds of good arguments, but that doesn't mean the arguments themselves are bad. So what we got going here is nothing more than an attack on the person. It's not a refutation of the actual pro-life argument. And we come back to this a lot in this show because what tends to happen is people get all worked up. You know, somebody's attacking you and you suddenly find yourself getting defensive. I remember a number of years ago, probably going back now at least 15, 16 years ago, I debated this guy who I'd never heard of. And there was no information on him leading up to the debate. And normally I do my opponent research and I do background investigations into what they actually argue, what have they written on the subject, what have they published, what have they lectured on. But this guy did not have a paper trail. And because it was for a friend of mine, I agreed to show up and do the exchange with this fellow. Well, it was really interesting what he did. His opening statement was to say, I can prove that Scott hates women and wants them to die from illegal abortions. And oh, by the way, he even thinks that women who are raped should be thrown in jail if they happen to have an abortion. And he really believes that he should be allowed to impose his religious ideology on all of us who disagree. And for the first 10 minutes he was going, and I mean, he just was going off on me. I found my blood pressure going up, and then it dawned on me, wait a minute, he has not argued anything that refutes what I put forward in my opening statement, my syllogism, my formal argument for the pro-life view. And once I just stepped outside being angry at the guy and just let him go, I stood up and I said, I really thought James was going to argue that I was wrong. I was relieved to see that he argued that I'm just a bad person, because at least then I could still be right. And the audience got a little bit of a chuckle out of that. But the point being, once I just stopped, took a deep breath and said, now, wait a minute, what is this guy actually arguing that refutes the case I just presented? So in my rebuttal, I simply said to the audience, look, I want you to notice something. I laid out a case for the pro-life view. I supported it with science. I supported it with philosophy. And notice that my opponent did not refute that case. Instead, he called me names. He said I was a bad person. Well, I might be the worst person on the planet, but still have a good argument. And ask yourself this question. What evidence did he present that refutes the case that I made? And of course, once I was able to reframe the debate on the merits, it took the wind out of his sails. When he just continued to attack me, it bounced off people who had been schooled now to focus on the argument. So I would encourage you, when you encounter these kinds of things, yeah, they're maddening. Yeah, they're the kind of thing you go, man, I really wish I could give this person a piece of my mind. Realize these are the weakest attacks on the pro-life view. Why? Because they don't engage it. Much more persuasive and challenging are people who either concede the unborn are human and say we can kill them anyway, Or they might argue that the unborn aren't members of the human family, and they actually try to present arguments as to why that's the case. Arguments we've dealt with on this show and undoubtedly will deal with again. But when somebody just makes the debate about you, you're really in the driver's seat if you just take a deep breath and say, wait a minute, even if this attack is true, so what? By the way, those two words, so what, ought to come back into your mental vocabulary. When people are going to try to refute you simply by being nasty to you personally, it's really helpful if you can just say, so what? Suppose they're right. What does that do to change anything here in terms of the arguments being advanced? Very helpful if you can just take that deep breath and kind of just relax a minute before you worry about it. Okay, we're going to take a short time out here. When we come back, I want to deal with something that I just came across thanks to our producer, Adrian, that really just had me almost breathless when I read it. We're going to talk about people who are taking their unborn human embryos that are on ice in fertility clinics, and instead of implanting them so they can be born, they're letting them be put into jewelry that they wear around their necks in the form of a necklace. We'll talk about that when we come back from this short break. Hello, friends. You may not have time to read a full-length treatment of abortion like I've done in this book, The Case for Life, the second edition, but you may have time to take what amounts to 7 sessions, a week's worth of study if you want to do it day by day, to learn how to defend your pro-life views persuasively. We have a basic course that will help you do just that. You will learn how to make a formal case for the pro-life position. You will learn how to defend it with science and philosophy. Even with non-Christians, you can make a case for the pro-life view. Then we'll teach you how to handle objections, how to recognize the 5 bad ways people argue about abortion, and how they often bring up things that are beside the point. You'll learn to keep the main thing, so that you're in charge instead of feeling like you're in the hot seat whenever the issue of abortion comes up. Visit the website for details. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Glad to have you with us. I mentioned before the break that we had come up with something that was really disturbing. It's an attempt to turn embryos into jewelry. And I'm just going to play the clip here and let you see it for yourself.
As a fertility and IVF specialist, when we do IVF cycles, there are extra embryos often left over. Some of these are genetically non-viable and can never be a pregnancy, and others are viable.
Okay, I'm going to stop right there because right out of the gate, he says something that is just factually wrong. He says some of these embryos are genetically defective and can never be a pregnancy. That's a crock of bull, quite frankly. Every embryo that is conceived, even one that might have genetic defects, is still a human being. A damaged human is not a non-human. He presents no argument for his belief that these are not real human beings. He simply asserts they're not even a viable pregnancy. Well, viability is another thing he doesn't argue for. How does it follow that because you depend on someone, you can be killed? He makes no argument for that. He simply, with a real quick rhetorical sleight of hand, tries to make it sound like these embryos are just genetic wastage and there's nothing more to them. So right away, we're getting some really shady argument here. Let's go on.
And couples are really conflicted what to do with them. There are 4 options. 1, you can use them. 2, they can be thawed out. They come to room temperature and they'll degenerate and be discarded. Number 3, they can be donated to another couple anonymously or known. 4, they can be donated for research. Embryos are not people.
Okay, embryos are not people. Why not? He makes no argument for why they don't count as one of us. He simply asserts it. Now, I was hoping in the clip he would actually lay out his reasons for why they're not human. Let's see if he does it or just goes on to the next point.
They're very special. They're not just a clump of cells. They are the potential to become a human life.
Okay, if you didn't catch that, he says, okay, they're not just clumps of cells. Okay, I'll agree with him on that, but he says they're merely potential life. What does that mean? A potential X must be an actual Y. So what are these embryos exactly? I mean, you can't just say potential. And basically what people mean when they say this is, well, we can draw this distinction between human being and human persons, and it's only persons that have the actual or immediate capacity for things like self-awareness, self-consciousness, the ability to value their own existence, their ability to solve cognitive problems, and whatever else they throw out. But they make no argument for why those things are value-giving in the first place. They just assert it, and that's what he's doing here. He makes no argument for why these things matter. Let's keep going.
And IVF specialists and embryologists treat them as such. We do have some couples that want to even bury them, and they do have that option. But turning them into jewelry, I'm really conflicted on what to think about that.
Well, let me ask a question here. Okay, I'm glad he's conflicted about turning embryos into jewelry. That ought to be disturbing, but why? Why are you conflicted? Why are you bothered by that? If embryos are just potential humans and not actual ones, it's only actual humans or persons that have rights, not mere potential ones. If he believes they're mere potential humans, why not use them for medical research or turn them into jewelry? Or use them for whatever you want, fishing bait if that were possible. It does not matter. The only reason why you should be bothered by this is if somewhere you know in your heart of hearts that this is not a way to treat human beings. Now, you might be thinking, what has gone wrong in our culture that would lead to people so callously treating their own offspring as an ornament they wear around their neck, rather than a baby that they nurture and love and help grow. I think there's an answer to it. We're seeing a shift in the culture that is profoundly disturbing. And I'm going to talk for just a few minutes in the time we have left about what this is. Author Carl Trueman has made the observation that what's happening in our culture today is the desecration of man. And here's what he means. The biblical view of human beings is that we have specific natures. And because we have specific natures, meaning we are image bearers made in the image of God, there are intrinsic purposes that go with being a human being. Human beings have intrinsic purposes they ought to fulfill, or if you will, obligations we ought to live up to in virtue of our humanity. What's happening in our culture today is the nature or the idea of human nature is not only being attacked at the ideological level, it is being desecrated, meaning an intentional attempt to destroy it, to devalue the idea that humans have value. And here's why. If you're living in a culture where people believe they have an unfettered right to define and construct themselves in terms of their identity, that means if they want to identify as a horse, they're a horse. If they're a man who says, I'm a woman trapped in a man's body, we're told we're obliged to accept that and not challenge it. If your identity is wrapped up in your feelings about what you want to be, and the idea of human nature counters that and says, guess what? You're a human being, and that means you have certain intrinsic purposes you ought to fulfill, and you have obligations that go with being a human being. If somebody puts forward the idea that humans have obligations they should fulfill as part of their nature as being humans, that's going to conflict right directly with people who think they are free to manipulate themselves and define themselves any way they want because there's no such thing as a fixed human nature. And what Trueman is getting at here is our technology today, think no further than your smartphone, has led us to believe that we are godlike in our ability to construct reality as we want to see it, including construct what it means to be human and including constructing our own identities. And so when someone comes along and says, wait a minute, Human beings from the earliest stages of development have intrinsic value, and they shouldn't be intentionally killed, discarded, or used for research. People come along and say, now, wait a minute. It's up to me to define where my value and identity comes from. Who are you to say there's a fixed idea of what it means to be human? That offends me. It makes me angry, and I'm not going to tolerate it. So what we're seeing, says Truman, is not just an attempt to oppose pro-life arguments, but an attempt to desecrate the very idea of humans having intrinsic value in virtue of the kind of thing they are, their natures. And this is an attack not only on the pro-life movement, it's an attack on biblical theism, which teaches very clearly that human beings are not valued because of some function they can perform. Rather, they have value because of whose image they bear. Well, that concept of the Imago Dei is highly offensive to people in today's culture who want to believe that they have an unfettered will to power to define themselves as they wish with no limits and nobody else saying that they don't have the right to do that. So the anger is ratcheting up to the point where some people will say, I don't give a rip at all about human life. I'll just turn it into jewelry that I wear. And we're surprised that people start treating children as commodities. And this is something our Christian churches need to start talking about, not just in an obscure Sunday school classes, but from the pulpit. What have certain technologies done to our ability to see human beings, children in particular, as gifts we receive rather than commodities that we construct for parental fulfillment? And one of the problems with a lot of the assisted reproductive technologies that are out there, which, by the way, I understand are designed with a good purpose in mind, to help couples struggling with infertility have children of their own. There's nothing ungodly about wanting to have a child of your own. I would argue that's a God-given desire, but not at any cost. And it doesn't mean that all means of allowing someone to have a child are ethical or biblical. Rather, we have to look at what does this particular technology do to the individual human beings involved. For example, any assisted reproductive technology that would destroy embryos would be out of bounds for the Christian. And I would also say we got to go a step further and ask this. What do these technologies teach us about human beings? Are they driving us toward a mindset that says children are commodities that we use to make parents happy and feel good about themselves? Or does this technology honor the intrinsic dignity of the child and teach us to receive him or her as a gift rather than a commodity we manipulate for parents' well-being? These are things we got to think about, and I do commend to you Carl Trueman's book, The Desecration of Man. I think it will give you some great insights as to why people can think they can treat children as necklaces. That's where we're headed, folks. God bless you. I'll see you on the next episode.